came a long way from St. Louis. You climbed the ladder of success. I've seen the flashy foreign cars that were parked out in front of your fancy address. You came a long way from St. Louis.
Well, I don't know how fancy my car is, but I did come a long way from St. Louis, just as Perry Como was crooning there in our theme song on this, the Radioactive Take, in our second week of narrowcasting, as I call it, here on YouTube. And delighted to be here, even more flattered by the fact that you've sequestered a few days. Well, it may go on that long if I don't shut up. A few minutes of your daily routine to check us out as we slowly but surely learn how to do this. And it is a learning curve for this guy, Brian Steibel, longtime commercial news talk radio guy, host of programs around the lower 48 in Detroit and Seattle, Albuquerque, San Francisco, and a few other burgs. But I thought I knew how to do this talking into the mic thing. And I guess I do, but only in a radio context. And that's why we're bringing some of the trappings of news talk radio, like a mic flag and an oversized mic and an oversized mouth, to the proceedings. But it's not radio, nor is it, to my surprise, really television. I've got some background in television. I worked in 4 different stations as a TV news writer and producer. First in Detroit and then 3 places in Chicago, major stations. And I thought then, and I still think, that I understand how TV news is produced and packaged. But what I didn't know until I started this last week is that this YouTubing thing is a different animal. It's not just a difference of scale. Obviously, the number of viewers of this little narrowcast is dwarfed by even an obscure television newscast, much less a national one. But it isn't just a difference of scale. It's a difference in kind. I've been learning the hard way here while doing the Radioactive Take on YouTube. And we'll try to shorten this learning curve, but no promises. All I can promise, and I do, is that we'll have 5 editions of the Radioactive Take for you each and every week. This being the second in our second week. So it's Tuesday, August 15th, 2023, which just happens to be the 54th anniversary of the first day of Woodstock. And we'll be talking about Woodstock in a few moments. Not the festival up there. We'll get to that later in the week, because after all, it was a 3-day affair in Woodstock, or near Woodstock. Originally scheduled for Woodstock, but the town fathers at Woodstock didn't want a bunch of dope-smoking hippies up there. So the promoters, Michael Yang and his partners, including Bill Graham, he was part of the Woodstock thing, they were forced to find another venue, that turning out to be Max Yasgur's dairy farm, and that's where 600,000 odd people, 600,000 odd in the sense of we don't know how many precisely, and I suppose a lot of them were odd people, but there were a lot of normal people coming up from New York and all over the country to be part of that, which was memorialized then in the big film, which really entered into the American consciousness both the word Woodstock, the name Woodstock, and the concept of these multi-artist festivals. It had been pioneered a couple years earlier at Monterey Pop. That was also memorialized in the film by D.A. Pennebaker, that shows up from time to time, including just a month or 2 ago on Turner Classic Movies. But it didn't really get rolling until Woodstock. Woodstock set the standard for these multi-artist festivals that everybody remembers, and many of us actually remember fondly. even if we weren't there. I didn't get to Woodstock, although a girlfriend of mine was there for the first day and only the first day. She and her party hit it. They couldn't stand the primitive sound system that was in place there in August of 1969, just a week after the Tate LaBianca murders, by the way. Charlie Manson and his so-called family doing their murderous thing. And then a week later, Michael Yang attracts over 500,000 people to a dairy farm, and the rest is rock history. And we're going to be talking about a little rock history here as we clean up an error of omission on my part from Friday's narrowcast. That was the, I guess, would have been the 11th of August, Friday, when in anticipation of Sunday, August 13th, we were doing a tribute to all things left-handed. Why? Because August 13th, every year since 1976, has been International Left-Handers Day, and thereby justifying my focusing on left-handed guitarists of note. And there's two that are much more famous than all of the other left-handed guitarists put together, I suppose. Jimi Hendrix. There's a statue of him playing guitar left-handedly in the Capitol Hill district of Seattle, where he's also buried out in the suburbs there in a town called Renton. But Paul McCartney's the other one that everybody knows. If they know him at all, they know he played left-handed. And they might even know a fact that I mentioned on that broadcast, that he got the idea of playing left-handed by seeing a picture of another left-handed guitar player, Slim Whitman, the yodeling guy. The late Slim Whitman was photographed somewhere, and McCartney saw that picture. He never saw him play on stage, or at least by that point when McCartney was just starting out and frustrated by the fact that he wasn't able to play guitar effectively right-handed. He said, hey, I didn't realize you could just flip the guitar over, switch the strings, restring it, and then play as if you were right-handed, even though you're still playing left-handedly. That's what Paul McCartney does, both on guitar and bass. And that's what somebody else does that I should have had on my list. I had Cesar Rojas of Los Lobos on my list. I had Dick Dale, the king of surf guitar, on my list. I had Bob Geldof, the driving force between first the Band-Aid benefit over there in Britain. Do They Know It's Christmas, which is one of my favorite Christmas songs. You hear it every Yuletide season, but not often enough. I like it a lot more than most Christmas songs, I'll tell you that. And then that in turn inspired the We Are the World session after the American Music Awards in I guess the spring of 1985. And then that in turn inspired the Live Aid double, you can't call it a double concert, it was a double stage set of concerts, I guess. Live Aid, both in London at Wembley Stadium there, and then hours later at JFK Stadium in Philadelphia, which is now demolished, and that's a shame because it was a historic spot for my money, because Live Aid, when considered in tandem, the first few hours over there in England and then coming to America in Philadelphia there, that is, I think, without question, the most important concert or set of concerts in the history of rock and roll, because all the big names played it, including my hero, Mr. Dylan. He closed the show. And here's something you may not remember about Live Aid. It took place on July 13th, 1985, and not many people remember, as they should, that one artist played both halves of Live Aid, and that was Phil Collins. How did he do it, you might ask? I mean, you got England. It takes a long time to fly over the Atlantic. How did he get to Philadelphia late in the day, early in the evening, to join all of the stateside acts that were performing there from the stage in Philadelphia? Well, the answer to that question, how did he do it? He did it on the SST. They helicoptered him, I guess, to Heathrow Airport, Phil Collins was, And then he got on the Concorde. I don't know if it was a British Airways or an Air France one, but it was one or the other. And flew into JFK over the Atlantic at supersonic speed, and then was choppered again to Philadelphia, nearby the JFK Stadium. And so he went from JFK Airport to JFK Stadium and managed to do what nobody else has ever done or probably ever will again. That is play on 2 continents in one day, in one paired set of rock concerts. Well, anyway, I got this email, and I'm surprised that we're getting email so quickly here at radioactiveseattle@gmail.com, because we're only in our second week, but I did get from a viewer by the name of Paul. It wasn't exactly a correction. It was an omission that he pointed out. He said, in your list of left-handed guitar players, Cesar Rojas of Los Lobos, Bob Geldof, Dick Dale, why didn't you, and Buddy Miles, why didn't you mention, he asked, Albert King? He was one of the greatest blues guitar players ever, and he did play left-handed. And just like Bob Geldof and Dick Dale, what he did, Albert King did, was, and I guess Buddy Miles too, they all didn't really play left-handed guitars. They would take the stringing of a right-handed guitar and just flip it upside down. Not flip the stringing, they'd flip the guitar upside down and play a right-handed instrument left-handed. But Paul McCartney didn't do that. He would actually switch the strings, as we described, and that's what I do, although nobody would confuse me with Paul McCartney's musicianship. So Albert King, yes, Paul, Albert King should have been on that list, and it was an omission on our part. Now, this wasn't an omission, but one name I didn't mention on Friday's Narrowcast was that of Tiny Tim, and I should have. Now, he didn't play much guitar, and when he didn't play left-handed. He played right-handed. But he played ukulele left-handed. And I don't know anybody else that's true of. Yeah, look at any picture of him, if it hasn't been reversed by the darkroom when it was printed up, as some published photos are. But most of them are correct, and you'll see that he's playing ukulele. I guess I got to do this because it's right up there. He's playing ukulele left-handed. Don Ho didn't do that. He played ukulele famously. And sang Tiny Tim, I almost said Tiny Tim. No, he sang Tiny Bubbles. Tiny Tim was a whole different concept. Made a hit out of Tiny Bubbles, but Don Ho always played ukulele right-handed, as do most ukulele players. But Tiny Tim is an exception to that rule. And I wanted to mention Tiny Tim, aside from the left-handed ukulele playing, I wanted to mention him on this edition of the Radioactive Take because you need to be alerted to, I would think, most people don't know about this, even if they know about the storied basement tapes that Dylan recorded with the band in upstate New York, near Woodstock, where Dylan was living, but not in Woodstock. It was in a place called West Saugerties, in a house called Big Pink. On the very first issue of Time magazine of the 1970s, I think it was dated maybe January 4th, 1970, first issue of that decade, the band found themselves on the cover of Time. Now, lots of musicians make it to the cover of Time, but after their first record, doesn't happen too often. I don't know that it's ever happened, except for the band. And their first record was indeed called Music from Big Pink, and that's the place. And I've been there, and you can be there too. You not only can be there, you can rent it out. Airbnb or one of these travel companies has a deal where you can rent it out for a couple of days. Maybe even go in the basement and record your own basement tapes. But it so happens that in March 1967, Tiny Tim was invited up to West Saugerties and sat in on one of the sessions that became later collectively referred to as the basement tapes. And if you add all the basement tapes, Dylan alone, Dylan with the band backing him up, the band singing a lot of them, add them all up, and there's something like 170, 180, 190, upwards of 200 basement tape tracks, most of which I don't think are very good, by the way, but that's a minority view amongst Dylan critics. Some people, including Greil Marcus, a well-known, well-established rock critic, thinks it's arguably Dylan's best album or set of recordings, but I can't agree. In fact, I would say it's one of his worst. It certainly features, the Basement Tapes do, one of his worst songs ever, something called Yay Heavy and a Bottle of Bread, with an exclamation point after the yay. I don't understand the title, I don't understand the nonsensical lyrics, and I don't understand why Dylan didn't toss that recording in the trash receptacle, because it's not very good. But it is part of the Basement Tapes, and it turns out now Tiny Tim was part of the Basement Tapes, thanks to these tracks that have only surfaced in the last year or so. And there's at least 4 numbers that Tiny Tim is singing in his falsetto lead on, with Dylan as a backup vocalist. Memphis is one of them. That's the Chuck Berry standard. You've heard that song 100 times, but probably not the way Tiny Tim performed it. I've Got You, Babe. Everybody heard that song repeatedly in Groundhog Day. Bill Murray's character wakes up to it recurrently on February 2nd. But again, Tiny Tim sounds different than Sonny and Cher did when they took that song to the top of the charts. There's also something called Sonny Boy. It's a song I was familiar with, but not from any album of anybody, but from a sitcom, oddly enough. I'm talking about the Bob Newhart Show. Remember when Tom Poston used to guest on the Bob, not Newhart, not the one where he's playing the innkeeper in New England, the one where he played the previous sitcom of Newhart's, called the Bob Newhart Show, when he played the psychologist, and his college buddy, who was in a lot of episodes as a recurrent character. They actually did a little vaudeville sketch at one point, Bob Newhart and Tom Poston did, there with the song Sonny Boy. That's where I first heard it. But I have to say, Tiny Tim's version is considerably superior. Well, one more thing about Tom Poston. You may not know this. I was surprised to read this. Did you know that he was married? I don't think he was the first husband, but he was the second or third husband of Suzanne Pleshette, who, of course, played the character who was married to Bob Hartley, the Bob Newhart character. Yeah, Tom Poston and Suzanne Pleshette got married late in their careers, and good for them. Now they're both no longer with us, and that's a crying shame. And one more Tiny Tim number with Dylan and the band, Be My Baby. That's on this tape. You know, the Ronettes tune, Phil Spector's wife's band. Well, it was a group, really, the girl group, the Ronettes, and his wife, Ronnie Spector, I guess, did that tune and took it to the top of the charts there in the mid-'60s. So if you want to hear Tiny Tim and Dylan on backup vocals doing any or all of these tracks, look for it on YouTube. Just search the names Tiny Tim and Dylan. Don't throw Don Ho in there. That'll just confuse the algorithm. So that's something to think about. And one more piece of cleaning up from an earlier edition of the Radioactive Take. I couldn't remember. And somebody, not an emailer, but somebody that is a friend of mine, and then called me up and said, hey, you forgot the name of the drummer who played with Dylan on the 1966 Going Electric tour. And he's right, I did forget. And I could have stopped and looked it up, I suppose. I didn't have the reference book at hand. But I just let the tape roll, and it's up on YouTube with that omission. I knew that Levon Helm, the normal drummer, the regular drummer for the band, didn't do it. He was on the U.S. part of that tour in late 1965, but after the final gig in Honolulu, he said sayonara, or maybe he said aloha, keep with the local culture, and Dylan's management people needed a drummer, so somebody recommended to them Mickey Jones, who had played with Trini Lopez, and I think later with Kenny Rogers in the first edition, I want to say. Mickey Jones, who would later enjoy a career as a character actor. He's in Sling Blade, as well as several dozen other movies, usually cast as a biker because he looked like one, and in fact was a biker, but he was very heavy set and rough-hewn in appearance, kind of like a guy in a motorcycle gang. So he was in a lot of films, but I remember him as the drummer on that 1966 tour when Dylan went electric. And then in the final leg of it, they first, after Hawaii, went to Australia and then toured Europe and culminated the goings-on with a tour of England, which included probably the most famous, certainly in the three most famous moments in Dylan's career. That's when in Manchester, on another Tuesday, it was the 17th of May, 1966, in Manchester at the Free Trade Hall. I've been at that building, not inside, but I've been in it. It's circular. It looks like Royal Albert Hall, but in a smaller city known as Manchester in the north of England. And it is downtown there in Manchester. And inside, on the 17th of May, that Tuesday, way up in the rafters, from Dylan's perspective, it was to his right, and way up there, not just in the balcony, but near the final row of the balcony, this fan of Dylan's who felt betrayed decided to express this in, can you call this the most famous single word uttered in the history of rock and roll? Maybe. What did he say? Well, he didn't say anything. He yelled it. He shouted, "Judas!" Implying that Dylan had betrayed his audience by going electric, just as Jesus was betrayed by Judas. Or so the four accounts in the New Testament tell us, the Gospels. Well, I don't think it was a betrayal. I think it was an upgrading of Dylan's art form when he went electric and opened him up to all kinds of new music, new musicianship, but also new types of songwriting that I don't know would have ever developed had he not gone electric, as they say, at Newport, Rhode Island in July of 1965, the previous year. But anyway, that's what happened back in 1966, and Mickey Jones was the guy who was behind the drum kit with Dylan for that historic moment in rock and roll history. And there's other things to talk about in the news and out of the news, but we're running long already, as we have found we habitually do. I'm trying to figure out how to move from a mindset of working in at least a 2-hour format. I don't think I ever had a radio show that was less than 2 hours, and because I was usually on in the middle of the night, most of my call-in shows were 3 hours or even 4 hours. In Seattle and in Detroit, I was on for 4 hours, past midnight, but 4 hours nonetheless. And with the signals those two stations were able to project, regional signals, yeah, that's a lot of listeners, even at 2 or 3 or 4 a.m. But here on YouTube, I'm trying to figure out how to move from that kind of a mindset to what you have to do or should do if you want to maintain the interest of your viewers. And that is work into a 10 or at most 15-minute format. But we're already running long, so I'll just remind you that we're here every Monday through Friday. And I hope you can be in the audience for every edition, but whenever you find it in your heart to find us on YouTube, I am deeply grateful, because I know you've got not just other choices. You've got at least 100,000 other people doing similar things. They may not have a mic flag or a background in commercial news talk radio, but they've got something to say, and they're saying it on adjacent or competing channels here on YouTube. And for me to inspire you to select my little thing called the Radioactive Take instead of all of those other choices, again, there may be 200,000 or 300,000, who knows? God knows, I suppose, but I don't. But I do know that I got to make it worth your while for you to be part of this audience for even one edition of the Radioactive Take, much less all 5 in a given week, which we will continue as of tomorrow for the Wednesday Radioactive Take, when we reconvene this little broadcast soiree over what we call WBQS News Talk Radio, a radio station which does not exist but it really oughta, in my view. See you tomorrow.